Hello, hello. It is Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the Sonic Scoop podcast. And today, we're going to be talking about speakers for mastering. And I'm going to talk about how I chose my speakers for mastering and give you some insights into how you can choose speakers for mastering for yourself. And you can figure out, are the speakers I currently have good enough for mastering? What makes a set of speakers good enough for mastering? What kind of features should we be looking for in a set of speakers for mastering? What kind of performance characteristics? And even if you're not interested in mastering yourself, I think there's still going to be a lot of great lessons from today's episode about speaker construction design in general, like what makes speakers good, and areas of performance in speakers you've probably never considered before, but I want you to start listening for. I will give away the goose right here at the beginning, which is that these speakers here over my shoulder, the Ex Machina Pulsars, are the speakers I personally chose for mastering. I used to use other speakers for mastering that were much, much larger, and I'll talk about what I liked about those and what I like about these and some things I like even more about these than my old prior speakers. And I'll give you a sense for what's the least you can spend on speakers for mastering. Because there's some considerations here in what you want out of a set of mastering speakers that separate them from being good enough for mixing compared to good enough for mastering and beyond. Big shout out and thanks to Ex Machina. They just sent me over these new ones. These are the Ex Machina Pulsar Mark II speakers. I had and been using for years the original Ex Machina Pulsars, and this new Mark II version, they upgraded me and sent these over and said, Justin, we want you to try out the new version and, give us a video if you can about them. So big thanks to these guys being longtime supporters of the channel. One of the founders of that brand, Dan Physics, I've known him for decades now, and he's a good friend. And I think he has exactly the right priorities when it comes to making speakers. It's one of these things, again, where I've developed a relationship with these guys because I really like what they do, and we align so much. I'm going to talk about some of the features in here that I like, but even if you're not interested in these specific speakers, which cost about $10,000 a pair, you'll still come away with some insights about, how much you can spend to get mastering quality and what are the specific quality considerations you should be looking at. Before we get into all that and a lot more and talk about speaker design and all sorts of different models of speakers for mastering, I want to give the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors. Most important one, always you. Hit that like button, subscribe, notifications bell, all that stuff. Big shout out and thanks to Sound Toys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. Absolutely wonderful stuff. And also, the best way to sponsor this podcast is to sponsor yourself for great full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, and today, Mastering Demystified teaches you everything I know about mastering. And I should probably segue into why am I capable and confident to talk about what makes mastering speakers good? Well, I am a platinum mastering engineer, and I've been doing audio stuff professionally for a couple of decades now, and mastering exclusively as my work for more than a decade. But beyond that, I'm one of these weird, rare guys who not only does the stuff and teaches about this stuff, but also has heard an absurd number of speakers in an absurd number of environments. And also, I have this little interest in, we're going to talk about what makes speakers go today, and it's fascinating. The physics behind this stuff, and we're going to make it very easy to understand and digestible. So real quick, I'll just get out of the way what speakers I used before and what kind of speakers I use now and how I chose them. So let me go over to my screen share here. The speakers that I used before these, when I really learned mastering over at Joe Lambert Mastering, and I'm still affiliated with Joe Lambert Mastering. Joe is a mastering mentor. Love the guy. His studio manager, Diana, is my studio manager. And the speakers that I learned to master on were these, the KEF, K-E-F 207-2. And here's what they look like. Here's a picture for those of you who are on the audio-only version of the podcast. These are some large floor-standing studio monitors that have 1, 2, 3, 4, actually 5 drivers in them. And they're at least 5 feet tall, probably taller than that. Maybe they're close to 5.5 feet tall, not quite, but really tall speakers. And you see a lot of these kinds of speakers in mastering studios. I'll tell you why I didn't go for this kind of speaker in my current studio, but these were absolutely wonderful. You can tell there are 3 major woofers down here, and then up here is what's called a coaxial design. which means there's this mid-range driver. And then inside that mid-range driver is a tweeter. And coaxial designs, I think, are absolutely wonderful. I'll talk about why they're one of my favorite types of speaker designs. And in here, there's an aluminum tweeter inside of that coaxial speaker. And you see, for those of you who are watching the video version, there's almost this bullet-shaped kind of vibe to this mid-range driver and tweeter, where it's separate from the rest of the cabinet. And this is to get rid of something called boundary interference, when especially some of these mid and high frequencies are coming off of the front of the speaker. They can kind of wrap around behind the speaker and cause kind of weird interference patterns that can create some issues. One of the ways of getting away with this is by mounting your speakers directly into the wall, and then you have like an infinite baffle. One of the other ways you can deal with it is to have these kinds of rounded designs. And you can see in the speakers over my shoulder, there's a lot of rounded corners on here for exactly the same kinds of reasons. And it takes very particular kinds of materials to be able to do these kinds of rounded corners well. You can't do it with just any old MDF particle board stuff that a lot of speakers are made out of. And I'll talk about some of the materials that go into this stuff. But now that you've seen my original speakers, I'm going to give you a closer look at the speakers that I have now. These are the Pulsars Mark II from Ex Machina. They are a three-way speaker design. Again, a coaxial design where we have this mid-range driver. And inside of the mid-range driver, let me bring this properly up on my screen. And inside of this mid-range driver, there is a tweeter, and a tweeter that's made out of something better than aluminum. We'll get into that in a minute and what kinds of tweeters we want for our mastering speakers. Because two of the big things that separate mastering speakers from speakers that are good enough for mixing is how well the low frequencies and the super high frequencies are represented. So I'm going to give away that point, but we'll go into exactly what that means in even more detail. One of the other big things I really like about this design is that it is a sealed box design. Unlike my prior mastering speakers, there's no port on them. And we'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages of ported versus non-ported designs. Then I'll talk about some of the materials that go into this. And I got to tell you, these guys offered to send me instead the Quasar Mark IIs, which are even bigger and go even deeper. And I said to them, that would be so awesome, but I really don't have the space in my current setup. I moved to a bigger house with a smaller studio. So no, these Pulsars are perfect. And I'll talk about why I didn't go for an even bigger model, even though that is something that I could have done. All right. With all some of that basic stuff out of the way about what speakers I've used in the past and what kind of design features I like, so we can talk about my biases and get them out of the way, I want to now go into the 4 major factors that I look for and I think are most important in mastering speakers. The first thing to get out of the way is frequency response. And if you watched my video recently, just a few weeks back now, about what separates a pair of $500 speakers from a pair of $5,000 speakers, the answer usually is not frequency response. Frequency response, these days especially, with DSP inside of so many pro audio speakers in the market today, frequency response is possibly one of the easiest, if not the easiest things to get right in high-end speaker design. And even now, you can buy speakers for $500 for a pair that basically within their rated range have flat frequency response down to plus or minus less than a dB. And obviously, these are also plus or minus less than a dB throughout their entire range. So flat frequency response is important, but that's not the only thing that colors the sound of speakers. In fact, there are even more powerful things. Once we've got frequency response flat, there are much more powerful factors. And possibly one of the biggest factors that influences the sound and the color of a set of speakers is distortion. And surprisingly, small amounts of distortion in the range of 1% or 2% can almost have the impact of a change in frequency response. Because if you get speakers that are measured at, say, 2% distortion, and honestly, a lot of lower-end speakers, they could be measured at 3 or 4 or 5% distortion. But that's across the entire frequency range. Often there'll be spots in the frequency range that have more distortion. And those spots in the frequency range that have more distortion, even though they will measure as flat when we take conventional measurements of speakers, they will sound amped up in certain areas relative to others because of the distortion characteristics. So if we have a monitor that's even 3 or 4% distortion overall, it could have even higher amounts of distortion in some spots relative to others. And it has the effect of sounding like it's skewing the frequency response, even though we're technically not skewing the frequency response. Justin, you're going to say to me, how is that possible? Well, think of it this way. Imagine a speaker that measures flat plus or minus 1 dB at 100 hertz. You play 100 hertz sine wave through it, or the 100 hertz fundamental of a kick drum through it, plus or minus a dB, it's going to be accurate. But here's what that's not factoring in. If at 100 hertz there's a considerable amount of distortion, that means whenever 100 hertz is played through that speaker, you're not only hearing 100 hertz, you're also hearing 200 hertz and 300 hertz and 400 hertz and 500 hertz and 600 hertz. When that 80 hertz of bottom end on a bass note gets played, you're not only hearing that 80 hertz at a perfect 1-to-1 ratio because the frequency response is right, you're also hearing these additional little, not quite echoes because they're not really delayed in time, but this shadow of the sound at not just 80 hertz, but at 160 hertz and 240 hertz and 320 hertz and 400 hertz and 480 hertz and 560 hertz and so on. Less and less as we go up. So what this means is that a lot of speakers that say they have flat frequency response, especially in the low end, when you hear what happens, you actually get this clutter in the low mid-range and the mid-range that can mislead you about your bass. And what will happen to a lot of mixers if they don't really understand their low end is that they will think that their low end is loud enough and can be heard because of all this additional distortion, mid-range distortion that's being stacked on top of their bass sound. They're mixing through speakers with distorted low end, and some of that distortion in the low end represents itself up into the mid-range. So they think that their bass is audible, but when it's played back on another system that maybe doesn't reproduce that kind of low end, all of that synthetic, distorted, phantom mid-range goes away. And all that they're left with is the amount of mid-range that they actually put into their bass sounds, which is generally going to be too little. And now we can't hear the bass or the kick on small speakers. It's a translation issue. So this is one of the first big things that I want out of mastering speakers relative to my mixing clients. I want speakers that are cleaner in the low end and through the entire audible spectrum than their mixing speakers are. Ideally, if you want to make really good decisions in mixing, you'll have mixing speakers that don't have tremendous distortion in the low end. And this is one of the reasons that non-ported cube-style monitors designs like Oratones or non-ported designs like Yamaha NS10s are popular for mixing, is because you don't get all of this additional low-frequency distortion appearing in the mid-range that makes you think you have an appropriate amount of mid-range in your low-frequency elements so that it can actually be heard. So this is one thing that I want. I want cleaner low-end when it comes to distortion than my mixing clients. But this lack of distortion that I want doesn't only apply to the low end. It applies to the high frequencies as well. Right now, I'm going to go a little further for you, and I'm going to focus a little bit more on the low end, because that's one of the things that's hardest to get right in the mix, and one of the things that a mastering engineer can help the most with. So we talked about frequency response. We talked about distortion and lower distortion. Now I want to talk about this idea of transient response. Sometimes when I tell people about transient response, they say, Justin, that just sounds like frequency. That doesn't make any sense to me. What are you talking about? This idea of a speaker having good transient response, it doesn't make sense. You're telling me transient response means the driver can move back and forth faster, but that's just frequency. No, it's a little different. And as I'm talking about this, I'm going to mesmerize you in the background, for those of you who are here for the video version, with images of speaker cones dancing. Speaker cones, all that they do is they move backwards and forwards, right? And if I can move that speaker cone backwards and forward quickly enough in a given amount of time, I can represent any given frequency. So for 1,000 hertz, if it can go back and forth 1,000 times in a second, that frequency is taken care of. But there's another component of sound. Sound is made up of two components. Sound is an expression of intensity over time. Whoa, dude, man, in a way, like music is just an expression of intensity over time, dude. Yes. So the intensity dimension is amplitude. I have a speaker that is fast enough to move back and forth 1,000 times in a second, but can it do it with the correct amplitude? Meaning, does the speaker cone excurt far enough in either direction in that amount of time in order for us to correctly reproduce the amplitude of the signal, the transient response of the signal? So a speaker with really fast transient response, with really accurate transients, is a speaker that can move a greater distance in the same amount of time. So imagine two speakers. One moves, accelerates and decelerates fairly slowly. Maybe it can only move 1/4 of an inch for each of our repeats at 1,000 hertz. The 1,000 times it's going back and forth in a second, each time it can move 1/4 inch out and 1/4 inch back. However, what the transient we're feeding it calls for is not 1/4 inch of movement, it calls for 1/2 inch of movement. But that speaker cone cannot move fast enough to get all the way out to 1/2 an inch forward and 1/2 an inch back and be back in time to make the full 1,000 cycle repetitions within that second. So that's one way of thinking about transient response. Is that speaker cone able to move far enough, fast enough to accurately represent not just the frequency, but the amplitude, little spikes in frequency? So that's something we learn to listen for. All right, man, I could watch speakers move all day. Another idea here is related. Distortion is actually related to transient response. And theoretically, if you were to perfectly recreate a transient at the right frequency with the right time domain response, it would be free of distortion. Because you can also think of distortion as being little extra wiggles in the signal. Here's something I want you to think about too. Imagine this. A speaker is supposed to move, let me get myself on full screen. A speaker is supposed to move forward and then back to center and then back to center again, right? Forward, back to center, back to center again. And say it's supposed to do this 1,000 times in a second. Well, if it can't accelerate and decelerate fast enough, or there's extra momentum that it can't discharge, it can end up going forward, center, back, and then a little phantom wiggle. So it can end up going like this. And those little extra wiggles, you can think of those as being the kinds of compromises in distortion and also to a degree in transient response, how well we're able to accurately reproduce the initial impulse and the sustain of a signal. So these are the two major factors that people aren't always looking for in mixing speakers that are super important in mastering speakers, and I want them to be better than my clients' speakers in those regards. So I've got to have not only great frequency response and great low frequency extension, but I also need this great transient response and this low distortion. And there's one more feature that I want to throw in there, or one performance characteristic that goes beyond frequency response, and that is a lack of resonance. And all of those things we were talking about before and also resonance lead me to my preference for, all else being equal, non-ported sealed cabinet designs like this one. Often I pick up the whole speaker and like show it to you guys. Like I hold it up, but I'm not going to do it with this because this speaker is about 55 pounds or so. Because even though it's not giant, It has no port in it. It is so much more solid, and it's made out of such heavier material than so many of the other speakers I've ever showed you guys that I can't really hold it up for you reasonably here sitting down. I mean, I can. I don't exactly have to like squat to lift the thing, but it would be super awkward for me to hold this thing sitting in my chair. It is heavy, and at least 50% heavier than any of the other speakers of a similar size that I've held up here that have ports in them. So this is a sealed box design. It's not the only kind of design for mastering speakers, but especially in a smaller speaker like this for mastering, this is the way that I like to go. And I'll talk about the trade-offs between ported and non-ported designs a little bit. But real quick, basic idea here is one of the reasons I prefer these non-ported designs is the lack of, first of all, the improved transient response, and also this lack of resonance. When we put a port into a design, we can end up with resonances in the low frequencies. Certain low frequencies can be artificially amplified compared to others. You can sometimes get these additional non-musical noise, almost like a chuffing noise on, say, a front-ported speaker, which are probably the most common for studio monitor designs. That's a little bit less of an issue with back-mounted woofers or side-mounted radiators, but those can experience significant boundary issues, especially if they're close to a wall, and those can have their own host of problems along with them. So when we take the port out of the equation, the low frequency becomes cleaner, faster, and more resonance-free. And I don't want to be misled about the low end. I want to have a completely accurate picture of what's happening in the low end on a record so that I can help mixing engineers and producers and self-recording artists make better decisions about their low end, the kinds of decisions they can't make in their own studios and the kinds of decisions they can't make on headphones. Now, this also requires having a good room, but most importantly, I want to have better sense of the lows, particularly from this critical range from about 40 hertz to about 100 hertz, where mixing engineers and producers and self-recording artists make the most mistakes. So I want that area of 40, especially like 40 to 90, that area where they make the most mistakes, to have a super clear picture of what's going on there to the best of my ability. And that's why I'm often looking for designs like these. If you can make a speaker large enough, I also am a fan of something called a transmission line design, which is basically a fancy way of saying a really, really nice port. The company PMC is famous for making these, and let's see if I can pull up on screen for you guys as we're talking an image of what a transmission line looks like. But the idea behind a transmission line, so a port is basically a hole in a speaker, right? And by putting a lot of space into a speaker, we can extend how deep that speaker goes with the same level of power. But we have these issues with resonances and chuffing and other stuff like that. But a transmission line, let's see if we can find images of these. Basically, instead of having a big hole, they have a smaller hole that wraps around a lot more inside. So there's almost like this labyrinth-like maze inside the speaker that increases the length of the port by taking a lot of little twists and turns and things. So let's see if I can find an image. Here's a transmission line design. So you see, instead of just having one big hole, the waveforms have to take a longer path through the speaker. Here's an interesting transmission line design here. You can see it's this more labyrinthine kind of path. And PMC is a great brand for these. Here's another transmission line, really long one here. And PMC are great at making really long transmission lines in their speakers. And also, if you were to get a pair of speakers like my older KEF monitors that I always used to monitor on, and Joe still has, once you have a bigger cavity like this for a port or transmission line to run in, they can become better and better and better and better. But the more compact the speaker is, generally the more that I'm going to prefer a closed speaker design, which is one of the reasons I really like the pulsars and quasars, because they can have such great low frequency without taking up much space. So what's the trade-off? Why would you not want to go, why would you want to go with a ported design at all? And here's the thing, price. At any price point, there are going to be ways in which ported speakers beat non-ported speakers and transmission line speakers. The biggest way that a conventionally ported speaker is going to beat a non-ported speaker is that the ported speaker is going to go much lower in frequency response at a much lower price point. These speakers that I have here, to get down as low as they do, as clean as they do, which is about, I think around 35 hertz, maybe 36, something like that, they need to be $10,000 for a pair. Where you can get that low on some speakers for, there's some speakers that have equally low frequency response to these for $500, and some really nice ones that have equally low frequency response to these for $1,000 to $5,000. But these are $10,000 because basically they need to have a much more powerful magnet and a much better, cleaner driver in order to be able to do this. Because the issue with a non-ported speaker design, let me make myself maybe a little smaller on screen here to feature the speaker a little more because I love it so much. With a non-ported speaker design, a sealed box design like this one, there's basically this pressure buildup inside the speaker. And the pressure buildup inside the speaker, and the pressure has nowhere to go, it really inhibits the low frequency performance and the potential for free movement of the driver. So to get rid of the pressure inside the speaker, one of the things we can do is add a port to it, or a transmission line, or some type of radiator on the side, or something like that, like a little speaker-looking radiator on the side. And these are things that we can do to get rid of that pressure for it to go deeper. But the compromise there is always with our transient response, with our resonance, and to a degree with distortion, potentially things like chuffing noises and additional boundary issues of sound hitting walls in ways that it shouldn't be. So how do we get rid of the pressure in a speaker design that is sealed? And the answer is you have a really, really, really big honking magnet and a really, really, really powerful speaker, so that the excursion of the speaker, it just goes out really, really far. This, you can maybe see it in my shot here. Here, I'll bring it up on the live shot. Maybe you can see on the surround here just how incredibly thick this surround is. The surround is this rubbery piece of material that is around the actual cone of the speaker. And the surround, the quality of it, the stiffness of it, the rubberiness of it, really affects just how far back and forth that speaker can move. And the way that you release pressure in a sealed box design like this, instead of putting a hole in the speaker, is you just allow this driver to move so much further. And this driver has to move so much further to get the same amount of low frequency extension and the same amount of volume. So it needs to have a much more powerful amplifier and a much more robust driver design. And that makes it cost more for the same amount of cleanliness. So I hope some of that makes sense. All right, I want to go some more in just a minute to some of the specific design and performance features I love about my particular speakers, but I don't want to make this just about my speakers. Again, shout out to these guys at Ex Machina. If you end up buying these or any other speakers, check out one of our affiliate links down in the description below. I'll try to also put the affiliate links in the comments. If you're buying speakers anyway, it's no additional cost to you. You just click on one of those links. Even if you're going to buy some guitar strings or something and not speakers, you can click on one of our affiliate links. And the next time you make a purchase, if it's soon, from your favorite store down there, we do get a little bit of a commission off of the affiliate link. So that is helpful to the channel if you want to support us at no additional cost. And hopefully if you're buying some $10,000 or $20,000 speakers, that helps to justify me putting out free content like this, where we go super nerdy and super detailed. Okay, so we've talked about most of the major things that I want to talk about around here. The lack of resonance, the low distortion. I also want to talk a little bit about the high frequencies and the mid-range. I've looked at this through the lens of low frequency, but the same kind of things apply to high frequencies. And I want to talk about some specific design features in this one and in prior speakers that I've owned. So, high frequency distortion. There are a few different major ways you can go with tweeters. One of the most popular types of tweeter designs is a soft dome tweeter. And just looking at my speakers here, you might think that they have a soft dome tweeter, but they don't. We'll get into that. These were originally often called silk dome tweeters because they could be literally made out of silk. A lot of them are synthetic these days. And the cool things about these soft dome tweeters and silk dome tweeters is that I think they can sound really pretty. They can have a kind of softened frequency response, and they don't usually have a lot of resonance at any one particular frequency. However, these softer materials don't perform in what is called going to be a big word here for a second, a very pistonic way as they get higher and higher in frequency, meaning they're less piston-like. They don't go back and forth cleanly as good. And you can have more like warbling in the movement of the soft dome tweeter. So the soft dome tweeter, since it's like the inverse of a cone, it's not exactly like a speaker cone where the whole cone moves back and forth. You can think of it almost more like ripples going through a pond. And soft dome tweeters, although I like them and they can be pleasant, they can have more distortion. So you can imagine it being like, instead of a very still pond that you drop a pebble into, that you have a pond that is already kind of choppy, that there's already some wind disturbance going on. And then you drop a really jagged stone into it. And then it kind of spreads in a, mostly circular way with some funniness. And that is the kind of distortion that we can tend to get in the high frequencies on soft dome tweeters. So they can end up feeling sometimes a little bit veiled and a little bit indistinct and a little inaccurate in the high end. So one of the ways that a lot of speaker brands go is they go with harder metal materials. And when you look at high-end speakers, like the KEF monitors that I used to master on, one of the most popular materials has long been aluminum for high-end speakers. And the cool thing about aluminum is it can be so low in distortion at high frequencies. And it can reproduce frequencies that are super duper high. This is awesome. The problem with aluminum tweeters is that although they're really low in distortion, because they're such a consistent material, aluminum, the same consistency that kind of gets us this low distortion, the same firmness and rigidity and thinness that gets us the low distortion, also makes them susceptible to, like any metal, resonances. Think of like a hollow aluminum bar and knock on it, right? You're going to hear a resonance. You ever been in a pool and then someone knocks on the metal handle to go up the pool? That kind of idea, right? Metal resonates. If you put your ear down on a train track, and you can hear the train coming from miles away, and if someone were to take a sledgehammer and hit it next to your ear on the train track, your ear's going to hurt, right? So there is this issue in the high frequencies with resonance when it comes to aluminum and even nicer rigid metals like beryllium that some fancy monitors like the Focal monitors are using now. And these are cool materials. The problem with them is it's not exactly that they have distortion. Because if you play a 12 kilohertz sine wave through a aluminum tweeter, it will measure correct frequency response, super low distortion. However, any vibration that might be happening in that same tweeter at, say, 20K actually resonates potentially down below at 10K. So when you play a 1K sine tone through it, according to the measurements we've taken, the frequency response and the distortion of that frequency, it looks fine. But the resonance of it, usually from a higher frequency, will like resonate downwards into the audible spectrum. It'll sound like there's a high frequency lift on every single aluminum tweeter or beryllium tweeter I've ever heard. Sounds like they have a high frequency lift. And some speakers do this better than others, but all of them feel like they have a high frequency lift. And a significant one, sometimes as much as 3 or 6 dB or more, is the feeling that you get, them having this shelf up in the highs, even though there isn't really a shelf up in the highs if you were to measure frequency response the normal way of measuring frequency response. So there's all these weird measurements that most people don't even know about that are as powerful as frequency response, if not more powerful than frequency response, that we haven't been trained to take into account. Now, one of the things I love about Ex Machina is they use some of these crazy space-age materials in this thing. And this is one of the reasons I'm going to shout out really why I like Ex Machina here. Now you get the whole big pitch for like why I chose these. Dan and his collaborator there, I think his name is Dev, the other co-owner who really is the total design nerd. They put in some of my favorite features. And that's why I had to have these speakers. One, it's a sealed box design. And when I don't want to go for giant floor standing speakers with a huge transmission line, I want a sealed design, and this was appropriate size for my space. I reserve the right to get the even bigger versions of these if I move my studio to another space in the house, which I might eventually. It's hard to justify it, but I kind of want to. All right. They use some crazy space-age designs, one of them being this material called, hold on, I have to look it up. It is called, let me bring up a picture. get here. I'll show you in Safari with me. Don't tell me. It's called something totally weird. Here it is. Metamodal text stream, I think is what it's called. And it looks like this. Next generation speaker diaphragms. Yeah, this material. Oh, here they are, the Ex Machina speakers. This is a space-age material that was literally used in the Mars rover. Like the Mars rover, the last one that landed, had some drones in it, and they literally used that for like the helicopter blades on the Mars rover drones. This material, metamodal text stream. And the idea is it almost has like the best features of something like aluminum or beryllium, in that it's really rigid and really low distortion, but it has some of the kinds of features that we like out of, say, a silk dome tweeter, which is that's not resonant either. Because it's this like fibrous material where there's some like kind of cross hatching going on, it doesn't have resonance in the same way that a metal would have. And that is being used now for the mid-range driver and the tweeters. So it's wonderful that they can get a material this stiff, this rigid, this lightweight, but that also doesn't have these resonance issues and resonance characteristics that you find in conventional metal tweeters. So love the sealed box. Love that they have a tweeter design that takes some of my favorite things from soft dome tweeters and some of my favorite things from metal dome tweeters and kind of gets rid of the bad trade-offs from both of them. Now, of course, there's always trade-offs in audio. So the trade-off with these is pretty much that they're more expensive and more space-aged and new. Then the other thing that I absolutely love about this design is a coaxial monitor. One of my other favorite sounding tweeter designs is a air motion transformer design. Some people call them a ribbon tweeter. They're famous on the Atom speakers and the Head speakers, and I think the Eve speakers all have those types of tweeters. I really like those as well. They have their own set of trade-offs. But A, you can't put them inside of a coaxial design reasonably, where the tweeter sits inside of the mid-range driver. And these actually just perform better as well as far as distortion characteristics go. And I think they perform equally as well when it comes to transient response. So they're my new favorite tweeter type, this metamodal text stream, if I'm hopefully saying that correctly. The other thing is like the cabinet design. They're brilliant with the kind of materials they're making here. Again, really space-age materials. There's a material here called Velcro mat. And I'm going to nerd out Velcro mat, I think is how you say it. I'm going to nerd out a little bit about materials. So, because what you'll find in a lot of less expensive speakers is they'll be made out of basically like MDF particle board, basically pulverized wood dust that's like compressed together. And that stuff is inexpensive. Lightweight, easy to machine in large batches. But the problem with that stuff is just kind of how supple and non-rigid it is, some of the lack of density. Velcro mat you can think of as being like a special version of MDF, where again, we have fibers that are crossing over each other. So it's one of these things where it has some of the benefits of MDF, but is way better than MDF. It has some of the benefits of hardwood, like the rigidity and hardness of hardwood is great, but hardwood can have a lot of resonance. Again, we use hardwoods for the face of an acoustic guitar because it resonates. Because all the fibers and grains go in one direction together, and hardwood can resonate relatively freely, and there'll be some resonant frequencies in even a sealed hardwood cabinet design. But this Velcro mat stuff, because of the ways the fibers, I think, basically are at crossed angles, we don't get that same kind of resonance we would out of a hardwood. And it's also easier to make these kinds of rounded corners with some of these materials, which are better for things like boundary interference, which we discussed a little bit earlier on. So those are some of the unique things about the Ex Machina speakers that I really love, but there's so many great speakers for mastering. That said, I would say the Ex Machinas are probably, and here's the sad part, some of the least expensive speakers I can possibly really recommend for professional level mastering. If you're saying, I want to make mastering like one of my main sources of income and I want to do it at a super high level and I want to do it with speakers, $10,000 is kind of the entry point. And some people are going to say, Justin, these aren't even good enough because they only extend down to, I forget what it is, 36 hertz or something. Now, for me, I think you could put a high pass filter, like a low cut filter, on every record you do in like rock genres and pop genres, like at 35 hertz, and roll everything below it off, and no one would ever notice. And in fact, a lot of people do just that. They're constantly using, in mastering, low frequency roll-offs around 30 hertz. And if you listen to like 90s records, those low frequency roll-offs can be as high as 40 or 45 hertz. But today they'll often go lower, and having low frequency roll-offs from 30 to 35 hertz, it might be a subtle roll-off, 6 dB slope or 12 dB slope. That's not uncommon on actual records. Now, there's certain genres where you might want to go even deeper than that still and still have significant energy, in the 20 and 30 hertz range. But a couple of things there. One, you can supplement with frequency analyzers. Two, you can just add a sub. And three, do you really trust your room that you're in to properly reproduce 20 and 30 hertz? Is the room you're in actually big enough to support those wavelengths without significant mode and node issues? And when you are adding a sub, you have this additional ability to, if you don't have a perfect room, put the sub in exactly a place that will help you deal as best as possible with things like room modes and room nodes. So the sad reality that for mastering on speakers, the sad reality is that spending $10,000 and up on speakers is normal, and then spending thousands of dollars on room treatment and not just broadband absorption, but often tuned absorbers is normal. If you're saying to me, Justin, I desperately want to do mastering, but I don't want to spend $10,000 on speakers, can I do it? The answer is yes, with an asterisk. You'll still want to have a really well-treated room. You'll still want to have better speakers than your clients who are doing the mixing. And you'll want to supplement with frequency analyzers to help give you additional clues about low frequencies. You want to do a ton of referencing, and you also want to supplement on headphones now in this day and age that can go down and really tell you very accurate things about 40 hertz or so. And if you can look at a frequency analyzer and make decisions about 20 or 30 hertz, or get a sub, and then really use something else, whether it's headphones or great speakers, that tell you real truth about 40 hertz to 80 or 90 or 100 hertz in a way that your mixing client speakers don't, then those are speakers that are potentially good enough for mastering. Well, I hope this has been useful for you guys. I hope this has given you some insights. I'm a big fan of these Ex Machinas. Riffs, Beards, and Gear says, I'm listening to the stream on Ex Machina Pulsar Mark IIs. Great to hear. Let me know, Riffs, Beards, and Gear, what you think about them. Die War says, what model Dyne Audio? Maybe asking someone else in here. So there's a lot of comments in here. I'm going to read through all these comments just after I finish here, and I'll respond to some of them in the chat. And if you leave an actual comment later, I'll try to read through and respond to a bunch of those as well. But I want to give a big shout out and thanks again to Ex Machina for upgrading me and sending me the new Mark II ones. I wish I had more space to take them up on the offer of sending me the Quasars to try out. But right now, I'm very happy with these and other supplemental ways to get me listening down below 35 hertz with great accuracy as well. So that's the only tiny drawback of them, is the lack of frequency response below 35. But I would say that if you're going to get speakers big enough that go down that deep, and they're doing it with a port, I would rather have speakers that cut off at 35, 36, 38, 40 hertz and do 40 to 80 super clean and super great, which these do. I would rather have that than a ported design with more distortion for mastering context that goes down to 20, not as well, and doesn't reproduce 40 to 80 as well. Because those are the big areas where you can really dramatically help your clients. But that said, adding a sub, planar magnetic headphones, planar magnetic headphones, and frequency analyzers, subs, all those things can support you with a speaker choice like these. Or you can go for even bigger speakers, because 10,000 is really the start for mastering. There's plenty of mastering speakers that are 20 and 30,000. But with that said, there are people always who have made great sounding records on cheaper stuff than the super nice stuff. And you can make great mixes on speakers that cost $500. if you want help from a mastering engineer, it's good to use one who can hear things better than you can and who has taste and experience that you respect. David Allen writes in to say, I own these speakers and love them. Great. I'm finding like all the Ex Machina people have been attracted to this. What's your opinion about the Cali Audio IN8V28 for mastering low-budget speakers? The IN8s are great mixing speakers. They're about $1,000 a pair. They're some of the best speakers for $1,000. I want to, again, have speakers better than my client speakers for mastering. Me mastering is a professional level, hopefully working on more platinum projects, in the future. For me, it wouldn't be enough. But speakers like those, the Calis, the SM5s and the IN8s, ruler flat frequency response, pretty good port for a ported speaker, and amazing value for the buck. But it depends on what kind of level you're trying to do this at. If you're putting out your shingle as I'm primarily a professional mastering engineer, I would not recommend a set of $1,000 speakers. I recommend a set of $10,000 speakers. That said, if you have some friends who are mixing on crappy Yamaha HS8s or something, and you have a nicer tuned room and some $1,000 monitors from Cali or $2,000 monitors from Atom, you could potentially master for them and do a better job than they would do themselves. So that's the other caveat that I want to add. Well, thanks again for hanging out with me. I want to give a big shout out again to Ex Machina, also to Sound Toys for sponsoring this podcast from the beginning. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days at soundtoys.com. Also, we've got a giveaway going on. Big thanks to Novation. I can't believe I didn't shout this out up front. Go over to sonicscoop.com/contest because we are giving away a keyboard from Novation, the FL Key 49. Really, one person is going to win this, so go over to sonicscoop.com/contest. We give away probably $100,000 worth of free gear every year on average, so definitely check that out, sonicscoop.com/contest. Shout out again thanks to Sound Toys. Shout out to you guys. And the last thing that I will shout out is you can check out my great full-length courses. If you do want to get into mastering professionally, check out Mixing Breakthroughs, etc. If you really only have $1,000 to spend on monitoring and you want to do mastering, I would recommend headphones. The MM500s from Odyssey cost about maybe $1,500 to $1,800. You can master on those potentially. There's some $400 and $500 headphones. Again, Odyssey and the Aventone planar magnetic 2s. You could potentially make good choices about stuff down as low as 40 hertz, better than on many people's speaker systems that will cost more than that. I would say that if you want to get started, just dipping your toe in the water of mastering, a set of $400 planar magnetic headphones and a course like Mastering Demystified, you get those two things, that's like $800 of spend, can, I think, allow you to master well enough to actually get paid for people who are not as far along in the journey as you are. And there are some mastering engineers today who are mastering using nothing but headphones. Granted, headphones that cost $4,000 or $5,000, but a pair of headphones that cost $1,500 can get you results 95% as good. And that's something to look at as well for the more budget conscious who want to master. Think about headphones and then think about a course like Mastering Demystified. As you are ready to go up, then we're talking about $10,000 of speakers and a whole bunch of acoustic treatment to make things really work. But at the lower end, I would not steer you towards going from $1,000 speakers to $2,000 speakers. For mastering, I would steer you from keep your $1,000 speakers, get some $1,000 headphones in a course like Mastering Demystified, and get education and really good headphones. And then as you're ready to go up, then we're looking at speakers more like the ones I'm talking about, where you're probably spending a minimum of $8,000 and potentially well above $10,000 or even $20,000, which is the norm for high-level professional mastering. That said, you can do work at lower levels than that and with lesser gear if you know your monitoring system really, really, really well. Thanks again for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. I'll see you next time.